All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into recognition.
Recognition.
Yeah, and I mean, for us as philosophers, like we know, recognition isn't just seeing, oh, I recognize that chair. That's a chair. It's got all these layers of, how should we treat each other? All this stuff wrapped up in, just the idea of recognizing someone.
Yeah, it gets at the normative dimension of how we ought to engage with one another, but also the psychological processes by which we come to understand ourselves.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh.
And so, as always, for this deep dive, we have an awesome source, and that's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on recognition.
Perfect. A comprehensive treatment of the subject, and really gets into the core of a lot of the arguments and ongoing debates in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, for our purposes, what we're going to be trying to do in this deep dive is really unpack what does it mean to recognize another person, to be recognized. Why does that matter so much for ourselves, for our society? And what are, some of the challenges, some of the disagreements about recognition?
Right.
And really, I think it'll give us all a good lens to view all sorts of different things, from personal relationships to, political landscapes, all this kind of stuff. So as a philosopher coming to this, how do we define recognition?
Yeah.
And how is it different from some of these adjacent concepts like identification?
Well, that's a really good starting point, because recognition, as the entry highlights, is not a univocal concept.
Yeah.
I mean, even Paul Ricoeur noted that there are different kinds of recognition that we can identify.
Right.
But one of the fundamental distinctions that often gets drawn is between recognition and mere identification.
Okay.
So to identify something and a particular logical fallacy.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily involve any positive valuation.
Okay.
Whereas recognition in the philosophical sense typically involves that kind of affirmation.
So it's not just recognizing, this proposition is valid or invalid,
right,
but recognizing, oh, the reasoning here is really sound.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then you also have the term acknowledgement, which in everyday speech is often used interchangeably with recognition. But some theorists have pointed out that acknowledgement is perhaps a little bit thinner than recognition.
Okay.
It might be that you acknowledge the validity of a claim or acknowledge that a particular state of affairs exists, but that doesn't necessarily involve the same level of affirmation of, someone's identity,
right,
or worth.
Okay.
But as the entry underscores, the concept of mutual recognition is really at the heart of contemporary philosophical discussion. So that there's this reciprocal relationship.
Okay, mutual recognition. So there's a back and forth. There's a giving and receiving there.
Yeah, there's an interplay between recognizing agents.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the entry goes on to talk about, some of the historical roots and, of course, Fichte and Hegel. How did they kind of lay the groundwork for our modern understanding of recognition?
Yeah, they're really the foundational figures here. I mean, Fichte and his philosophical system argued that our self-consciousness doesn't arise in isolation.
Okay.
But rather, it emerges through an encounter with another rational subject.
Yeah.
And so we come to understand ourselves as agents, as selves, through an interpretation of the other's actions as directed toward us. He calls this being called upon.
Right. So I guess you could say that our self-awareness, in a sense, it develops socially.
Yeah.
It's not something that's inherent. We kind of see ourselves reflected in other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then Hegel, of course, took this and ran with it famously.
Oh, yeah. And this is really where you get the famous master-slave dialectic,
right,
in the phenomenology of spirit. So, Hegel picks up this idea, this initial interpersonal encounter, and argues that it develops into a struggle for recognition, this fundamental drive to be acknowledged by the other as an autonomous, self-determining being.
Okay.
But Hegel argues that this struggle, if it culminates in a relationship of dominance and subjugation, master and slave, that kind of recognition actually fails to achieve genuine recognition.
Why is that?
Well, because the master sense of self isn't truly affirmed by the slave's recognition, because that recognition isn't freely given by an equal.
Oh, I see. Because the master needs to be recognized by someone who they recognize.
Exactly.
So if they're dominating someone and that person is forced to give them recognition, it doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah, exactly. And Hegel develops these ideas further in his later work, The Philosophy of Right,
Okay.
where he lays out 3 spheres that are essential for what he calls social freedom. So this would be the sphere of love within the family, which involves what he calls affective recognition.
Okay.
The sphere of contractual respect in civil society,
Yeah.
based on the recognition of rights and our mutual interdependence.
Okay.
And then the sphere of solidarity within the state, which involves a shared sense of belonging and mutual support. So these spheres, with their different forms of recognition, are really crucial for individuals to experience themselves as fully integrated and affirmed members of the community.
Okay. So for Hegel, recognition isn't just like this psychological desire. It's like really necessary for us to function.
Yeah, it's constitutive of selfhood.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also a necessary condition for a just and stable social order. And, for our philosopher listeners, I think it's important to point out the influence of Kojet's reading of Hegel.
Okay.
And particularly his emphasis on the struggle for recognition, on later thinkers like Sartre and Lacan.
Right. Okay, so that's a good overview of kind of the historical roots. And then the entry goes on to talk about who or what can be a subject and object of recognition.
Right.
And, they make this distinction between a narrow and a wide view.
Yes.
So for us as philosophers, like, what are the implications of that distinction?
Well, the narrow understanding, which is kind of the dominant view in contemporary recognition theory, sees recognition as fundamentally interpersonal.
Okay.
So a reciprocal relationship between subjects who are capable of recognizing each other.
Okay.
And this implies that only beings with the capacity for this kind of mutual recognition can truly be subjects and objects of recognition.
Okay.
So the wider view suggests that we can also speak meaningfully about recognizing the value or the significance of things like animals, natural environments, even works of art, regardless of whether they have the capacity for reciprocal recognition.
Okay, so you could say, like, an environmental ethicist might say, we should recognize the value of this ecosystem,
Exactly.
even though the ecosystem can't recognize us back.
Yeah, that would be an example of the wider understanding. But the dominant trend, really, I think, in contemporary recognition theory is on that interpersonal dimension. And that raises, some interesting questions for us as philosophers.
Right.
Like, who counts as a subject and an object of recognition within this interpersonal framework?
Right.
So individuals are the primary focus, of course.
Right.
But what about, the developing capacities of children?
Right. Like, at what point does a child,
Yeah.
like, enter into this reciprocal thing
Yeah.
where they are recognized?
Yeah, and that's a really, developmentally and philosophically interesting question.
Yeah.
And the entry, drawing on, psychoanalytic theory and developmental psychology, highlights the foundational role of the early parent-infant relationship. So even in these pre-linguistic interactions, there's this kind of this dynamic of mutual responsiveness that suggests that the infant is beginning to recognize the caregiver as a distinct and a significant other.
Right. So even though they can't talk yet, even though they don't have language yet, they're still picking up on these cues. And I guess you could say the parents are recognizing the child as well.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, and this kind of lays the groundwork for these more complex forms of recognition later on.
It's like the first kind of dance of recognition,
Yeah.
Even before words, just responding to another person's needs, expressions, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And then, you also get into these complexities of collective agents. So can groups or corporations or states be properly understood as subjects and objects of recognition?
Right. So this is getting into, like, collective intentionality, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when it comes to groups that exhibit, shared intentions, a degree of internal coherence and a kind of collective self-understanding, there's a general acceptance that, they can both recognize and be recognized, particularly when that shared identity becomes, the target of misrecognition.
Right.
But the status of, more complex entities like corporations or states, I mean, that's more contested. Can they really have autonomous collective intentions? Or are their actions always just reducible to the aggregate actions of individuals?
Right, right.
And you think about, international relations. You often hear, about, one state disrespecting another state. But philosophically, is it really the state that's being disrespected, or is it the governing apparatus, or,
Yeah.
Ultimately the citizens whose will the state is supposed to represent?
Right. That distinction seems really important there.
Yeah.
When you're trying to analyze these claims about collective recognition or misrecognition, I guess, the same thing would go for like, not just states, but like institutions in general.
Yeah.
So legal systems, economic systems,
Yeah.
all this kind of stuff.
I mean,
Yeah.
these things can have a huge impact. They embody all sorts of norms. But the question is, are they being disrespected in the same way that a person can?
Yeah, that's right. And institutions, while they don't have agency in the same way that individuals do, or even, maybe even cohesive groups do, they embody and perpetuate norms and attitudes that have really profound effects on the way individual and groups are recognized. Avishai Margalit, famously argues that a decent society is one in which the institutions of the society aren't a source of humiliation.
Right.
And so, a lot of political resistance often stems from the perception that, institutions themselves are implicated in these practices of misrecognition. But the entry raises, this further point. Can institutions themselves be disrespected in the same way, in a meaningful sense? I mean, one might say that they can be disregarded or undermined, but perhaps only persons or groups can really experience the kind of misrecognition that really cuts to the core of their sense of self. Right. So even though an institution can be a source of misrecognition, the misrecognition is directed at the people within that institution.
Yeah.
So it comes back to sentient beings.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so let's move on to the forms of recognition. So the entry talks about this historical shift from pre-modern notions of honor to modern concepts of respect, esteem, this kind of stuff.
Right.
Like, how does this reflect, changes in our philosophical understanding of ourselves?
Well, this historical transition is really, really pivotal. I mean, pre-modern honor was so deeply intertwined with one's ascribed social position within a hierarchical order.
Okay.
But with modernity, with the rise of Enlightenment thinking, you get this concept of equal respect.
Okay.
This idea that all individuals, by virtue of their shared humanity and capacity for autonomy, are entitled to a certain fundamental level of recognition. And this is where you also get the idea of esteem, tied to an individual's specific achievements or talents or contributions. And so this introduced a new dynamic, where certain forms of recognition became more contingent and more contestable.
So it's a move from being recognized because of where you are in society,
right,
to like being recognized because of something inherent in you as a person, your worth.
Yeah, exactly.
Or because of things that you've done,
right,
your achievements, right?
Yeah. And of course, both of these continue to shape our social interactions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Charles Taylor, he gives us 3 forms of recognition. I think he's picking up on Hegel a little bit here.
Yeah, I think so.
So he's got the politics of universalism, which is that shared human nature.
Right.
Politics of difference, where we recognize and value unique identities like cultural identities.
Right.
And then the recognition of concrete individuality. So that's more in the realm of like love and friendship.
Yeah, exactly. And the entry notes that Honneth kind of interprets these as stages in the development of self-confidence, self-respect, and self-esteem.
Okay. So he's adding this psychological aspect.
Yeah, and then the entry kind of moves on to this idea of, elementary recognition.
Okay.
So, what's the philosophical significance of this idea?
Yeah, like what is that supposed to be?
Well, elementary recognition really gets at the very preconditions for our shared social and epistemic world.
Okay.
So neo-Hegelian philosophers argue that our very understanding of reality is cooperatively constructed through these processes of mutual recognition.
Okay.
So when I recognize you as, possessing, what some call epistemic authority, the capacity to make valid claims, to offer reasons.
Right.
I'm participating in the creation of what Robert Brandom calls this shared normative space of reasons. So my ability to understand and accept something as true is often contingent on my recognizing you as a fellow rational agent,
right,
who can contribute to that understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And think about the very act of communication through language. I mean, that presupposes that we recognize other speakers as competent participants
Oh,
in a shared linguistic framework.
so it's not just about like affirming each other as people, but it's about like the possibility of us sharing knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and it's also a powerful critique of atomistic theories of subjectivity. It emphasizes this fundamental embeddedness in shared webs of meaning
Right.
and justification. And some theorists even go so far as to argue that empathy, this capacity to understand and share the feelings of another,
Yeah.
that this is actually a prerequisite for grasping their evaluative reasons, suggesting that recognition in this fundamental sense might actually be more primary than cognition itself.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And there's a lot of psychological research, on the role of emotional attachment in early childhood. That lends some empirical support to this idea. And so you also have, the idea of antecedent recognition,
Okay.
which is this kind of initial and often implicit recognition of others as persons, as beings with their own perspectives, their own claims.
Okay.
And ideologies or social practices can lead to a forgetfulness of recognition,
Okay.
where we begin to treat others as mere objects or instruments.
Right.
And so, crucially, Brandom emphasizes that this elementary form of recognition is a deeply normative attitude.
Okay.
It involves this understanding that others are capable of undertaking commitments,
Okay.
that they have certain entitlements,
Right.
and that we can hold them accountable,
Right.
within this normative framework.
Okay. So this is like the foundation. This is how we can even begin to talk to each other.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's the ground, the shared ground. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to respect then, because this is like, central to our modern understanding of human rights and all that good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, the idea of equal dignity and respect,
Okay.
that's really become the cornerstone of modern recognition theory.
Okay.
And it's very closely tied to universal human rights.
Right. Okay.
And so you have thinkers like T.M. Scanlon, who argue that the very basis of our moral obligations to one another really lies in this idea of mutual recognition.
Okay.
So recognizing each other as beings whose capacity for rational agency demands a certain kind of treatment.
Okay. So it's seeing that in each other.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
It's valuing that inherent capacity, that inherent dignity in every person.
Right.
And so, I think the distinction between recognition respect and appraisal respect is really helpful here.
Okay. Yeah. What's
Yeah.
that distinction?
Well, so recognition respect, as we've been talking about, is that fundamental equal moral standing that we grant to all persons.
Okay.
But appraisal respect is about valuing someone for their specific qualities,
Okay.
their achievements, their talents.
Right.
So this is more akin to esteem or admiration in everyday life.
Okay.
But the focus in this context is really on recognition respect.
Right. So that baseline, that bare minimum.
Yeah, it's the baseline of regard that's owed to everyone,
Yeah.
just simply by virtue of being human.
Okay.
And a lot of the discussion, I think, in this area of recognition theory focuses on the experience of disrespect and humiliation.
Okay.
So, the extreme forms of humiliation where individuals are systematically denied any basic recognition as persons.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the most vivid illustrations of our fundamental need for this kind of respect. And this is where Margolies' idea of a decent society really comes in. So a decent society is in part characterized by the fact that its institutions don't humiliate their members.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they at least give everyone that bare minimum.
Yeah. And the entry, I think, nicely points out the interplay between the normative and the psychological dimensions of humiliation.
Okay.
Because even when you maybe intellectually understand that the degradation that you're experiencing is unjustified,
Right.
it can still inflict this really profound psychological harm.
Yeah.
So it erodes your self-trust. It erodes your trust in the social world.
It makes it hard to keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, even less extreme forms of mistreatment.
Okay.
The historical denial of equal legal standing or political standing
Right.
to certain groups. Those also represent fundamental failures of recognition respect. And this is, where the establishment of equal rights, both, positive rights, entitlements to certain goods and services,
Mm-hmm.
and negative rights, protections from interference,
Right.
that those play a vital role in institutionalizing recognition and fostering individual self-respect.
So it's like codifying it in our laws.
Yeah, yeah. Although there's this tension that the entry brings up,
Okay.
and that is that rights, while they do acknowledge individual autonomy, if you focus too narrowly on negative liberty, so freedom from interference,
Okay.
without paying attention to the broader social and economic context, that can actually fall short of ensuring genuine recognition.
Right. So you can have your rights, but if you're not able to exercise them,
Yeah.
it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and this is a point that critics from Hegelian and communitarian perspectives have long made. Yeah, and then of course you also have the guarantee of equal democratic rights.
Right.
Recognizing citizens' capacity for participation in the common good.
Right.
That's also essential for ensuring robust recognition, respect.
Right. So that gives people the ability to actually have their voices heard.
Exactly.
Not just on paper. Okay. So that's respect. We've got this foundation. Now let's move to esteem.
Okay.
Because it seems like this is where things get a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, I think so. Because this is really where the questions of social difference and identity really come to the forefront.
Okay. Yeah.
And whereas those earlier emancipatory movements were really focused on achieving equal respect.
Right.
Contemporary struggles for recognition often center on the affirmation of particular cultural, religious, or other forms of identity that have been marginalized or devalued by dominant societal norms.
Right.
And so this is what's often called the politics of recognition or identity politics.
Okay.
And there's two main normative arguments that get advanced in support of this.
Okay.
The first emphasizes the need for what's called context-sensitive respect.
Okay.
So proponents of this argue that what we think of as neutral social norms and standards often actually reflect the values and perspectives of dominant groups.
Okay.
And so, genuine equality requires acknowledging and accommodating the needs and the perspectives of different groups.
Okay. So it's not enough to just say, okay, everyone's the same, everyone gets the same treatment, because there's all this historical baggage
Exactly.
that comes with different groups.
Yeah, and this is often the justification for policies like affirmative action.
Okay.
Which are often seen as a way to counteract these historical disadvantages.
Yeah.
and make participation in social and political life more inclusive.
So to make a more level playing field, not just to have one on paper,
Yeah.
but to actually to make it happen in the world.
Exactly. And then the second, kind of more radical argument, I think, asserts that particularity itself, so particular cultural practices,
Yeah.
group identities, that those possess inherent value and deserve to be esteemed.
Okay.
And this line of thinking raises all sorts of complex questions, about the nature of group identity.
Right.
I mean, questions about intersectionality.
Right.
The potential for oppression within groups.
Right. Right.
Even the very possibility of deconstructing these fixed notions of identity.
Right. Yeah. It gets very complicated very fast.
Yeah. And there are, big ongoing debates, about whether, cultures should be valued in and of themselves or just because they're valuable to individuals. Do these values, do these cultural values necessitate the granting of group rights?
Okay.
How do we value all cultures equally without resorting to this kind of superficial token acceptance?
Right.
So Charles Taylor suggests that we need to approach other cultures with this kind of presumption of value,
Okay.
this openness to learning
Okay.
from these traditions that have sustained themselves for so long.
So it's like giving people the benefit of the doubt, like
Yeah.
assuming that what they're doing, that their culture is valuable in some way.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And it's this delicate balance between affirming particular identities and avoiding these pitfalls of essentialism,
Right.
or creating new forms of social stratification. Yeah. And then some philosophers argue that esteem should really be directed at individuals for their specific qualities, their achievements, rather than at groups.
Okay.
But that raises the challenge of how do we establish impartial criteria for judgment,
Right, right.
in this pluralistic world.
Yeah.
And then others counter by saying, well, if you neglect this dimension of social esteem, you fail to account for this everyday experience of needing to feel valued and respected, needing to be able to appear in public without shame,
Right.
without this fear of denigration. And this is where someone like Bourdieu is really, really helpful.
Okay.
His work on the role of these evaluative patterns
Okay.
in shaping our social status,
Right.
our experience of recognition. And one proposed solution that the entry discusses is to focus on achievement as kind of a formal basis for esteem. So something that can be defined within specific social contexts, but still allows for individual particularity and allows individuals to make contributions to the common good.
Okay.
So unemployment, for example, could be understood as a really profound denial of this kind of esteem.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But even this focus on achievement, it faces criticisms.
Okay.
It's hard to establish really truly culturally neutral criteria. And then there's this recognition gap.
Okay.
This idea that not all aspects of our identities that we value might fit neatly into these categories of achievement that supposedly contribute to the common good.
Right.
And ultimately this focus on esteem, it often aligns with communitarian philosophical perspectives.
Okay.
That emphasize the importance of flourishing within these bestowing relationships of mutual recognition.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like in a way, esteem is layered on top of respect.
Yeah.
So respect is that baseline.
Right.
But then esteem is saying, okay, now we're going to recognize all these other things about people and make them who they are. Okay, and then, we have to talk about love and friendship as well.
Yeah. So this is kind of the most intimate and personal sphere of recognition.
Right.
And it's especially significant in psychological theories of recognition.
Okay.
So this experience of loving care in early relationships is seen as absolutely foundational for the development of basic trust.
Okay.
Security,
Right.
self-worth.
Okay.
And really the capacity for these more mature forms of recognition later in life.
Right. So it's like the training ground. It's